There's one commonality when it comes to portraits and fashion and beauty images, and that is skin. They all contain skin. So let's look at the colour of skin. Primarily, we would say that skin is red, but it can vary a lot. Skin is also what we call memory colours. We tend to know instinctively whether it's right or wrong. People look at each other and look at skin all the time, and therefore we become experts at assessing what skin really should be. We can't isolate the colour of skin from the colours around it. Of course, if there's a strong cast on an image, that will also affect the skin. But generally we say that you have a higher amount of red, a slightly lower amount of green, and a very low amount of blue in skin. When we communicate skin colours, we very often describe skin in terms of CMYK because it's easier to define the relationship there between the magenta and yellow, which makes up the red, and we can therefore describe it more precisely in CMYK than in RGB. For example, one of the most common problems is exaggeration of magenta, too much saturation in the skin. And this is very often caused by the default settings of digital cameras that tend to saturate. They saturate the reds a bit more, bringing very often out too much magenta. This also happens on transparency films, especially when they're pushed, and they have a tendency to give the skin a very hectic blush. Whenever we add contrast in post-production, we automatically add some saturation, so an S-curve is not always the best solution for skin. Often there's a problem with red blotchy legs, especially hands and ears and noses. So you've got to know how you can manipulate that and how you can bring it back without just desaturating it. Because if you do desaturate it, all that happens is that the skin goes grey. And that's not usually what you want. So you've got to be able to control these relationships between the colours in RGB. And at the same time, you need to think CMYK. Let's have a look at some different skin types and some typical readings in the info palette. Looking at Caucasian skin, essentially it's red, but yellow is very often the most dominant component. Often it's just a few points above the magenta, but if you have a higher magenta than yellow, usually you would characterize that skin as being a bit pink. Now that's often the case in babies and redheads and people who are generally flushed, but most Caucasian people have a slightly higher yellow in the skin tone. One problem that often arises with Caucasian skin is fake tan, especially in fashion and beauty. Fake tan is never quite as even as we'd like it to be, and very often it gives a very unnatural high content of yellow. So in those cases, we might need to take the yellow down a bit. The only skin type where you can allow for as much as 20% higher yellow than magenta is olive skin. But that's also quite desaturated, so if you think in terms of CMYK, the cyan would also be quite high. If you manipulate Caucasian skin in a way that takes out red, i.e. drives the colour towards more cyan, then you'll find that you're actually desaturating the reds. Asian skin tends to be quite desaturated, but it veers a little more towards the yellow. Sometimes it can actually help with a slight magenta infusion to give it a fresher feel. Skin of African origin tends to have a slightly higher content of cyan and therefore is less saturated than Caucasian skin. And the darker the skin, the higher the cyan content will be. When you're manipulating an image, this can be either reduced or it can actually be exaggerated, making the skin a little bit more blue. I'm going to show you 3 different patches of skin. One is Caucasian, a sort of golden Caucasian colour. The other one's a mid-tone African type skin. And the third one is a fair, very rosy Caucasian skin. Now what happens if you manipulate these? We're going to assess this now both in RGB and CMYK, and I'm putting the colour star right next to it here. Starting with the Caucasian skin, if it's quite yellow golden and you add cyan, that can make the appearance a little bit green, a little bit cold as well. If you add blue, it can reduce the saturation because it's complementary to yellow. It reduces the main colour a little bit, and that can sometimes work. If you add magenta, it can drive it towards a slightly too hectic red. If you add red, that can sometimes work. It can sometimes just give it a little bit more glow if you find that it doesn't have enough saturation. And if you add yellow, it'll make it too saturated and usually too green. And of course, if you add green, then it will also become too green. Looking at a mid-tone, not very dark African skin, it tends to be a little bit more magenta red. So adding yellow will make it more golden, but also a little less natural. If you add cyan, you remove some of the saturation and it tends to appear a bit darker. Adding magenta will add even more saturation to it and it can seem a little bit flushed and a bit unnatural. Whereas if you add red to it, you're giving it a little bit more glow, a little bit more saturation, saturating the colour that's already in the skin. Adding green, not only does it desaturate, but it actually makes it appear a bit sickly and not very natural. Finally, let's look at some rosy Caucasian skin. Now this isn't very common type skin, but sometimes you get this colour just in cheeks, so let's look at what it does. Usually it's not very saturated to start with, but if you add magenta, that will obviously saturate it and exaggerate the redness or the pinkness more. The trick is often to add yellow to it. It deepens the colour a bit and changes the character towards a more golden type of skin. Using green does that even more so, but that can often seem unnatural for the type of skin, and you may end up going a bit too far with that. If you add red, of course, then you intensify the rosiness and the saturation, the overall saturation, so you might want to avoid that. And if you add blue, skin that's already quite pink will appear even more so. So I'm working in RGB, but I'm thinking in RGB and CMYK all the time.